Welcome to 221B Baker Street.
Chapter 1. The spectre in the music room, the late autumn of 1088 remains, etched in my memory, as a period of singular atmospheric gloom. A persistent yellow fog had descended upon London, muffling the clatter of hansom cabs and transforming the familiar reaches of Baker Street into a series of spectral, gaslit vistas. Within our rooms at 221B, the fire crackled with a defiant cheerfulness, though it did little to dissipate the restless energy of my friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. For 3 days, the great detective had been without a case worthy of his mettle. He had spent the morning indoors, alternating between a volume of obscure medieval music and the periodic, agonizing scrapings of his violin. I sat across from him, attempting to lose myself in a medical journal, yet my eyes kept drifting to Holmes. He was currently hunched over a chemical retort, his thin, hawk-like nose inches from a bubbling blue liquid. "You are thinking of the war again, Watson," he remarked suddenly, his voice crisp and devoid of preamble. I started, dropping my journal onto my lap. "How on earth did you know that?" "I haven't uttered a word in 20 minutes. Holmes allowed himself a thin, enigmatic smile, though he did not look up from his experiment. "It is a simple chain of inference. Your eyes fell upon the portrait of General Gordon on the mantel from there. Your features took on a look of mournful reminiscence. You then unconsciously massaged your left shoulder site of that Jezele bullet wound from your Afghan days. The connection is elementary." "Extraordinary," I murmured, as I always did, despite years of such demonstrations. "It is a trifle," he sighed, standing up and casting his pipette aside. "I crave mental exaltation, Watson. The London criminal classes have become lamentably unimaginative. My correspondence this morning consisted of a lost lapdog in Peckham and a suspected forgery that turned out to be nothing more than a spilled inkwell. I fear the world is becoming a very dull place." He had barely finished the sentence when a frantic, rhythmic pounding echoed from the street door below. We heard the hurried footsteps of Mrs. Hudson, followed by a brief, hushed exchange. A moment later, our landlady ushered a visitor into the room. The lady was young perhaps, in her mid-twenties, and possessed a refined, if currently haggard, beauty. She was dressed in deep mourning weeds of the finest silk, but her bonnet was slightly askew, and her gloved hands trembled violently as she clutched a small velvet reticule. "Mr. Holmes," she gasped, her voice barely a whisper, "I was told you were the last hope for a soul in despair." Holmes stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with that sudden, piercing intensity that signaled his interest was piqued. He took her hand and led her to the armchair by the fire. "Pray compose yourself, miss." "Vance," she replied. "Elara Vance. My father was Sir Julian Vance of Blackwood Manor." "Ah, the celebrated virtuoso and philanthropist," Holmes noted, leaning back and joining his fingertips. "His passing 2 months ago was a significant loss to the musical world. If I recall correctly, he died under quite natural, if sudden, circumstances." "So the doctors said," Miss Vance replied, her eyes wide with terror. "Heart failure, brought on by age and a lifetime of artistic passion. But, Mr. Holmes, it is not my father's death that brings me here. It is what has happened since we interred him in the family vault." She leaned forward, the firelight casting long, dancing shadows across her pale face. Blackwood Manor is an old house, Mr. Holmes Gothic, draughty, and filled with the echoes of the past. My father's greatest treasure was his Vance Stradivarius, a violin of incomparable tone. Since his death, that instrument has remained locked in its case, inside a glass display cabinet in the music room. The room is kept locked, and I hold the only key. "And?" Holmes prompted, his body perfectly still. "For the past 3 nights," she whispered, "at precisely 12 minutes past midnight, the music begins. It is my father's favorite piecebox chaconne in D minor. It is played with his exact phrasing, his haunting, melancholy vibrato. But when I steel my courage and open the music room door, the room is empty. The violin sits undisturbed behind the glass. The air is cold bitterly, impossibly cold, and the music stops the moment the lock turns. I felt a cold shiver trace its way down my spine. The fog pressed against the windows like a living thing, and for a moment the comforts of Baker Street felt very far away. Holmes, however, merely straightened his collar. A violin that plays itself in a locked room, he mused, a phantom of a smile playing on his lips. And at a specific time, no less. Tell me, Miss Vance, besides yourself, who currently resides at Blackwood Manor? Only the servants, she replied. Old Martha the housekeeper, and Mr. Graves, my father's long-time valet and secretary. He is a sombre man, devoted to my father's memory. He is as terrified as I am. He claims it is Sir Julian's spirit, unable to rest while his music remains silent. Spirit, indeed, Holmes muttered. The universe is big enough for many things, Watson, but I have yet to find a ghost that can resin a bough. He rose abruptly and checked his pocket watch. There is a train from Victoria Station in an hour. If we hurry, we can reach the Kentish borders by nightfall. Miss Vance, I suggest you return home. Dr. Watson and I shall follow. I should very much like to hear this midnight recital for myself. As our client departed, looking slightly bolstered by Holmes' clinical approach, my friend turned to me. His boredom had vanished, replaced by the electric vitality of the hunt. What do you make of it, Watson? It sounds like a delusion of grief, I said honestly. Or perhaps some acoustic trickery of an old house. Perhaps, Holmes said, reaching for his long ulster coat. But a Stradivarius does not play Bach of its own volition. There is a cold, calculated logic behind this spectre, Watson. And where there is logic, there is a human hand at work. Come, the game is afoot. Chapter 2, The Shadows of Blackwood Manor, the journey into the heart of Kent was a sombre affair. As the train rattled southward, the urban sprawl of London gave way to a landscape of skeletal trees and frost-nipped fields, all partially submerged in a creeping autumnal mist. Holmes sat huddled in the corner of our first-class carriage, his chin sunk upon his chest, lost in that deep, meditative trance that usually preceded his most brilliant deductions. A locked room, Watson, he said suddenly, breaking a silence of nearly 40 miles. A Stradivarius that plays with the soul of a dead man. It is a problem with a most exquisite geometry. You truly believe there is a physical explanation? I asked, pulling my rug closer around my knees. The girl seemed genuinely terrified. If it were a trick, what could be the motive? Motive is a fickle mistress, Holmes replied, staring out at the darkening woods. Greed, revenge, or perhaps a more esoteric desire to preserve a legacy. Sir Julian was a man of vast wealth and even vaster talent. Wealth creates shadows, Watson, and in those shadows, secrets fester. We reached the village of Blackwood, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a bruised purple light over the countryside. A weathered trap awaited us, driven by a man whose face was as cragged as the cliffs of Dover. He spoke little, his eyes darting nervously toward the looming silhouette of the manor as we approached the iron-wrought gates. Blackwood Manor was a sprawling, Elizabethan edifice of grey stone, smothered in ivy that looked like grasping fingers in the twilight. Its gables rose sharply against the pale sky, and the narrow leaded windows reflected the dying light like sightless eyes. It was a house that seemed to breathe the very essence of the pastor place where the line between the living and the dead felt precariously thin. We were met at the heavy oak door by Mr. Graves, the valet. He was a tall, angular man with a complexion the colour of parchment and eyes that seemed perpetually fixed on some distant, invisible sorrow. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said, bowing stiffly. "Miss Vance is in the drawing-room. She has been unsettled since her return. The house is not what it was when Sir Julian's music filled these halls." Naturally, Holmes said, his eyes already roaming the entrance hall, noting the heavy tapestries and the polished, yet worn marble floor. A house of mourning has its own particular atmosphere. "Lead the way, Mr. Graves." Miss Ilara Vance greeted us with a mixture of relief and renewed anxiety. After a brief dinner, which Holmes barely touched, he requested to see the music room immediately. The room was situated in the western wing, at the end of a long, draughty corridor lined with portraits of stern-faced Vance ancestors. As Graves produced a heavy silver key and turned the lock, the door swung open with a mournful groan. The music room was magnificent, yet chilling. The walls were panelled in dark mahogany, and a grand piano stood like a silent monolith in the center. But it was the glass display cabinet against the far wall that commanded our attention. Inside, resting on a bed of crimson velvet, lay the Vance Stradivarius. Even in the dim light of our lamps, the wood of the instrument seemed to glow with a deep inner fire. Holmes approached the cabinet with the reverence of a priest at an altar. He did not open it yet. Instead, he knelt to examine the floorboards, then rose to scrutinize the heavy velvet curtains that draped the tall windows. "The lock on this door is a standard Chubb," Holmes remarked, poking at the keyhole with a magnifying glass. "And the glass of the cabinet?" "Untouched, sir," Graves replied, his voice trembling slightly. "I dust the exterior myself every morning. The key to the cabinet remains on Miss Ilara's person at all times." Holmes turned his attention to the windows. They were shut tight and bolted from the inside. He ran a long, thin finger along the window sill, then brought it to his nose. "Beeswax," he muttered. "Freshly applied. And the temperature, Graves?" Miss Vance mentioned a sudden chill. "It is as if the hearth itself dies when the music begins, sir," the valet whispered. "A cold that seeps into one's very marrow." Holmes paced the length of the room, his footsteps silent on the thick Persian rug. He stopped before a large, ornate clock on the mantelpiece, a heavy piece of French gilt. 12 minutes past midnight, Holmes mused. A very precise time for a haunting. "Tell me, Graves, did Sir Julian have any particular affinity for that hour?" "It was the hour of his greatest triumphs, sir. He always finished his London recitals at exactly that time. He called it the Golden Echo." "I see," Holmes said, his eyes flashing with a sudden, sharp light. He turned to me. "Watson, I believe we shall spend our night in the corridor outside this room. I have a fancy to see if the ghost of Sir Julian Vance respects the presence of the law." As the house settled into a heavy, oppressive silence, we took our positions. The fog had thickened outside, pressing against the manor like a shroud. I checked my service revolver, a habit from my soldiering days, while Holmes sat on a hard-backed chair, his eyes fixed on the music-room door, his long, thin fingers drumming a silent rhythm on his knee. The minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed 11, then the half-hour. The air in the corridor grew perceptibly colder, a biting draught, seemingly rising from the very floorboards. Then, as the clock began its 12 heavy tolls, a sudden sharp click echoed from within the locked room. My heart hammered against my ribs. I looked at Holmes. He was leaning forward, his entire being focused on the door. At exactly 12 minutes past midnight, the first notes drifted through the heavy oak. It was the cicanello, mournful, and played with a technical perfection that was nothing short of divine. The melody rose in a haunting swell, filling the dark corridor with a sound so vibrant, so alive, that it was impossible to believe it came from an empty room. "Stay back, Watson," Holmes whispered, his voice taut. He stepped toward the door, his hand reaching for the knob. He turned it. It was, as expected, locked. But as he pressed his ear to the wood, the music suddenly reached a frantic, screeching crescendonade. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, it stopped. A silence followed that was more terrifying than the music itself. And in that silence, I heard it distinct, unmistakable sound of a heavy weight being dragged across the floor inside the room. Chapter 3. The footprints in the frost. The silence that followed that heavy, dragging sound was more oppressive than the phantom music. It was the silence of the tomb-thick, stagnant, and smelling faintly of old wood and something more acrid, like burnt ozone. "The key, Miss Vance." "Quickly," Holmes cried, his voice cutting through the gloom like a barker's whistle. Ilara Vance appeared from the shadows of the corridor, her face a mask of waxen terror. Her fingers fumbled with the silver key, and for a moment the metal clicked uselessly against the escutcheon. Holmes, with a gesture of uncharacteristic impatience, snatched the key from her trembling hand. He turned the lock with a sharp snap and flung the door wide. I burst into the room behind him, my revolver leveled at the darkness. The music room was exactly as we had left it. The grand piano stood silent, the sheet music remained undisturbed on its stand. Through the glass of the display cabinet, The Vance Stradivarius rested in its crimson cradle, its polished surface gleaming mockingly in the light of Holmes' raised lantern. "Gun!" Miss Vance sobbed, leaning against the doorframe. "It is always the same. The music, the cold, and then nothing." "Not nothing, Miss Vance," Holmes remarked, his voice tight with concentration. He was not looking at the violin. He was kneeling on the Persian rug, his lantern cast low to the floor. "Watson, bring your lamp over here. Careful where you step. The dust of this room is a diary of the night's events." I moved forward cautiously. The temperature in the room had plummeted. My breath came in white, ragged plumes. It was an unnatural cold, sharp enough to make my eyes water. "Look here," Holmes said, pointing to the heavy rug. It had been shifted several inches to the left, bunching up against the leg of the piano. This accounted for the dragging sound we had heard. Beneath the displaced rug, the floorboards were bare and remarkably clean. "A mechanical device?" I ventured. "A hidden trapdoor?" "I think not," Holmes muttered, tapping the wood with his knuckles. "The ring is solid, and yet the rug did not move itself. Now, the window." He crossed the room in 2 long strides. The heavy velvet curtains were still drawn. Holmes yanked them aside, revealing the tall, leaded panes. The glass was coated in a thick layer of frost knot, the delicate, fern-like patterns of nature, but a heavy, opaque crust. "Locked from the inside, as you observed earlier," Holmes noted, testing the iron bolt. "Aren't yet." He unbolted the window and pushed it open. A rush of freezing night air swirled into the room, smelling of damp earth and decaying leaves. Holmes leaned out, his lantern illuminating the narrow stone ledge and the flower beds 3 feet below. "Ah!" he exclaimed. "Watson, pray join me. Miss Vance, stay with Graves in the hall. I want no more feet treading this path than necessary." I climbed through the window onto the frozen earth of the garden. The frost here was even thicker, a white shroud covering the dormant rose bushes. There, etched clearly in the silvered crust, was a trail of footprints. They were singular and strange. They did not begin at the house, nor did they lead away from it in a straight line. Instead, they appeared to circle the music room window in a frantic, uneven pattern. "A man's boot," I said, leaning down. "Size 10, I should judge. But look at the gait, Holmes. The left heel is heavily worn, and the stride is unnaturally long." "Excellent, Watson. You are developing a keen eye," Holmes said, though his attention was elsewhere. He was following the tracks toward a thicket of yew trees that bordered the estate. "But observe the pressure. The toe is deep, the heel light." Our visitor was running, perhaps dancing. We followed the trail into the shadows of the yews. Suddenly Holmes stopped. The footprints simply ceased. There was no sign of a jump, no mark of a ladder, and no return trail. The white expanse of the frosted lawn beyond the trees was pristine and undisturbed. "He vanished into thin air," I whispered, the eerie nature of the case beginning to weigh on my medical nerves. First the music in a locked room, and now a spirit that leaves half a trail in the frost. "Spirits do not wear boots with worn heels, Watson," Holmes snapped, though his brow was furrowed in uncharacteristic perplexity. He knelt and began to brush away the frost from the last footprint. "And they certainly do not drop their personal effects." He reached into the frozen grass and retrieved a small dark object. He held it up to the lantern light. It was a jagged piece of dark, translucent resinth type used by violinists to provide grip for their bows. "Our ghost is remarkably well prepared for a performance," Holmes said, his eyes narrowing. "He brings his own resin, he plays the chaconne with the skill of a master, and he possesses the ability to move through solid walsa, at least, to make us believe he does. But the cold, Holmes, the dragging of the rug." "The cold is the most interesting factor," Holmes replied, his gaze returning to the darkened manor. "It is a physical effect, Watson. And in science, a drop in temperature usually suggests a rapid expansion of gas or a chemical endothermic reaction. We are not dealing with the supernatural, we are dealing with a very clever, very cold-blooded human being." He looked up at the light shining from the music room window, where the silhouette of Graves, the valet, could be seen standing like a sentinel. "Come," Holmes said, his voice dropping to a low hiss. "There is a second suspect in this house, that Miss Vance did not mention, a suspect who leaves no footprints at all, but who has been watching us from the moment we arrived." "Who?" I asked, looking around the dark garden. "The past, Watson. Sir Julian's past. We must look into the history of that Stradivarius. I suspect the violin is not merely an instrument, but a key to something far more valuable and far more dangerous." As we made our way back to the house, the wind picked up, moaning through the eaves of Blackwood Manor like the very music we had just heard. I glanced back at the yew trees. For a fleeting second, I thought I saw a flicker of movement, a tall, thin shadow that did not belong to the trees. But when I blinked, it was gone, leaving only the biting cold and the silence of the frost. Chapter 4. The secret of the Stradivarius the following morning broke with a grey, lethargic light that struggled to penetrate the heavy velvet curtains of the Blackwood Manor breakfast room. Holmes was already down, his plate of untouched kippers cooling before him while he pored over a stack of yellowing ledgers and musical journals he had commandeered from Sir Julian's library. "You slept little, I gather," I remarked, pouring myself a stiff cup of tea. "Sleep is a luxury for the mind that has already solved its puzzles, Watson. Mine is currently entangled in a web of catgut and varnish," Holmes replied, his eyes never leaving a page of the Musical Times dated 1874. "Tell me, did you observe anything peculiar about the performance last night, beyond the obvious impossibility of its occurrence?" I thought back to the haunting strains of the chaconne. It was flawless. The technical execution was, well, it was Sir Julian. I have heard his recordings on the early phonograph cylinders, and the phrasing was identical. "Identical," Holmes repeated, snapping the journal shut. "And therein lies the first crack in the porcelain. Art, Watson, is never identical. A man may play a piece 1,000 times, and each time the emotion, the humidity of the room, or the weariness of the fingers will dictate a subtle shift in tempo or vibrato. Yet last night's performance was a mirror image of Sir Julian's 1882 recital at the Albert Hall." "A phonograph, then," I suggested, "in that freezing temperature. The wax cylinders would crack, and the horn would betray itself with a mechanical hiss. No, the sound we heard was live, vibrant, and possessed of a most peculiar resonance. It was the Vance Stradivarius, of that I am certain, but it was not being played by a ghost." He rose and beckoned me to follow. We returned to the music room, which looked far less menacing in the dull morning light. Mr. Graves was there, fastidiously polishing the mahogany wainscoting. He straightened as we entered, his pale face appearing even more gaunt than the previous night. "Miss Ilara is still resting, sir," Graves said softly. "The night's events have taken a heavy toll." "Understandable," Holmes said briskly. "Mr. Graves, I should like to examine the Stradivarius once more, and I shall require the key to the display cabinet." Graves hesitated, his eyes darting toward the instrument. "Miss Ilara holds the key, Mr. Holmes. It was her father's wish that only she— The dead have many wishes, Graves, but they rarely have the foresight to account for a detective's requirements," Holmes interrupted with a sharp edge to his voice. "Fetch it, if you please." Once the valet had departed, Holmes turned to the cabinet. He didn't wait for the key. He pulled a small, silver-handled magnifying glass from his pocket and began to breathe on the glass, watching the condensation patterns. "Observe, Watson," he whispered. "The frost we saw on the window last night was localized. It was not a natural frost. It was concentrated around the frame. And look at the base of this cabinet." He pointed to the floor. A thin, almost invisible line of white powder rested against the wood. I touched it. It was cold, even now, and evaporated instantly against the warmth of my skin. "Carbonic acid snow," I gasped. "Used in laboratories for cooling." "Precisely. Our ghost is quite the chemist." The sudden chill was not a spectral presence, but a rapid release of pressurized gas, likely to create the atmospheric effect and, more important, obscure the movements of the performer. The door opened, and Miss Vance entered, looking pale but determined. She handed Holmes a small, ornate key. He unlocked the cabinet and carefully, almost tenderly, lifted the Stradivarius from its velvet bed. He turned the instrument over in his hands, examining the purfling and the scroll with an intensity that bordered on the obsessive. Suddenly, he froze. He peered into the F. hostess-shaped openings on the violin's face. "Watson, your pocket torch," he commanded. I shone the light into the dark interior of the violin. There, etched onto the inner wood in a cramped, modern hand, were the initials. L.M. Holmes' breath hitched. He quickly replaced the instrument and locked the cabinet. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice dropping to a low, urgent tone, "did your father ever mention a man named Luigi Moretti?" The young woman blanched, clutching the back of a chair for support. "Moretti? He was my father's greatest rival in the 70s. A brilliant luthier and violinist who claimed my father had stolen the Vance Stradivarius from him in a gambling debt in Venice. He went mad with bitterness. He died in an asylum 5 years ago. So the records say," Holmes muttered, his eyes alight with a dangerous fire. "But records can be forged, and asylums have doors that swing both ways. Watson, we must return to the village. I have a telegram to send to Mycroft. I need the passenger manifest of the SS Lombardy, which arrived from Naples 3 weeks ago." As we left the room, I caught sight of Graves standing in the shadow of the corridor. He was watching us, his expression unreadable, but his hands were clenched so tightly that his knuckles were white as bone. "Holmes," I whispered as we reached the front door. "If Moretti is dead, who is playing that violin? That, Watson, is what we are about to find out. But I fear the golden echo is about to become a death knell. We have been looking for a ghost, but we should have been looking for a shadow that has been living in this house far longer than Miss Vance's suspects." He paused on the threshold, looking back at the dark, ivy-clad manor. "The secret is not in the music, Watson. It is in the silence between the notes. And tonight, we shall force that silence to speak." Chapter 5. The man who wasn't there. The walk to the village of Blackwood was a brisk one, the damp air clinging to our coats like a wet shroud. Holmes marched with a feverish pace, his head tucked down, the collar of his ulster turned up against the biting wind. He remained silent until we reached the small, ivy-clad post office, where he spent a considerable time composing a lengthy telegram to his brother, Mycroft. "There, Watson," he said, stepping back onto the muddy lane and lighting a cigarette. "If anyone can dig up the truth regarding the late Signor Moretti's death in that Neapolitan asylum, it is Mycroft. The man is a human filing cabinet for the more inconvenient truths of Europe." "You suspect Moretti is alive?" I asked, struggling to keep pace. "But the initials in the violin, could they not have been there for years? A mark of the maker or a previous owner? The ink was fresh, Watson. Or rather, the scratching was sharp and unweathered by the natural vibrations of the wood. It was a taunt, a signature left by a man who believes he is a ghost." Holmes stopped suddenly, turning his gaze back toward the distant grey silhouette of Blackwood Manor. "Tell me, did you notice the chimneys as we left?" I blinked, surprised by the shift. "The chimneys?" I believe 3 were smoking. "The kitchen, the drawing room, and perhaps the master suite." "Exactly," Holmes snapped. "And yet, Blackwood has 14 fireplaces. One particular flue, situated in the west wing near the music room, was emitting a very faint, bluish vapor, not the thick soot of coal, but the shimmering heat of a spirit lamp. Someone is keeping a very specific part of that empty wing quite warm." We returned to the manor under a sky that threatened snow. Miss Vance was nowhere to be seen, but Graves met us at the door, his eyes appearing more sunken than ever. He informed us that a local doctor had been called to administer a sedative to the young mistress. "A pity," Holmes murmured, though his eyes were dancing with a predatory light. "Watson and I shall retire to our rooms for a brief rest. The night promises to be evocative." Once inside our shared suite, however, Holmes showed no intention of resting. He waited until the house grew still, then beckoned me to follow him into the corridor. We did not head for the music room this time. Instead, Holmes led the way up a narrow, winding staircase used by the servants, ascending toward the very gables of the house. "The architecture of these Elizabethan piles is a marvel of inefficiency, Watson," he whispered, his pocket torch casting a narrow beam against the timbered walls. Secret passages are a cliché of the sensation novel, but dead spaces created by poorly aligned flues and double-panelled closets are a reality of the builder's craft. He stopped before a heavy oak wardrobe in a disused box room directly above the music room. With a strength that belied his lean frame, he pushed the furniture aside. Behind it lay a small circular door, barely 3 feet higher maintenance hatch for the chimney sweeps of a bygone era. Holmes crawled through, and I followed, my heart thudding against my ribs. We emerged into a cramped, triangular chamber. It was surprisingly warm. On a small wooden crate sat a spirit lamp, a half-eaten crust of bread, and a stack of copper pipes that disappeared into the floorboards. Beside these lay a series of heavy, insulated canisters. "The source of our spectre, Watson," Holmes whispered, gesturing to the canisters. "Solidified carbon dioxide. When released through these pipes into the room below, it creates a rapid drop in temperature and a low-lying mist. A theatrical effect, but a highly effective one. But it was the object in the corner that drew my breath away. It was a strange, skeletal contraption of wires and pulleys connected to a long, thin rod that descended through a hole in the floor. A mechanical linkage, I noted, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to click into place. It moves the rug from above. And more than that, Holmes added, pointing to a small, brass-rimmed aperture in the floor. "Look down, Watson." I pressed my eye to the hole. I was looking directly down into the music room, specifically at the Stradivarius in its case. From this vantage point, a man could watch the room in perfect safety. "So, someone lives here," I whispered. "The man who wasn't there. A man who knows the house, knows the music, and has the technical skill to rig a cooling system and a mechanical haunting," Holmes mused. "But look at this, Watson." This is the secret clue I had hoped for. He picked up a small, discarded scrap of paper from the floor. It was a pharmacy receipt from a chemist in London, dated only 4 days ago. It was made out to a Mr. L. Graves. "Graves," I hissed. "The valet. But he was in the hall with us when the music played." "Indeed he was," Holmes said, his face hardening. "Which means Graves is not our performer. He is merely the stage manager. He is providing the food, the chemicals, and the cover. But if Graves is the manager, who is the virtuoso? Who is the man in the shadows who plays the chaconne with the soul of a dead man?" Suddenly, a low melodic hum vibrated through the floorboards. It was the sound of a violin being tuned slowly, methodical as somewhere very close to us. The stakes had risen in an instant. We were no longer chasing a ghost, we were trapped in the rafters with a madman and his accomplice. "Back to the hall, Watson," Holmes commanded, his voice a low, urgent rasp. "The trap is set, but the predator is closer than I anticipated. We must reach Miss Vance before the midnight recital begins, for I fear tonight's performance has a final, fatal movement." Chapter 6. The discordant chord. We retreated from the cramped attic space with the stealth of marauding cats. Holmes' movements were jerky, fueled by a frantic intellectual energy that I had come to recognize as the prelude to a breakthrough, a disaster. The air in the lower corridors of Blackwood Manor felt even more stagnant than before, thick with the scent of old floor wax and the approaching storm. "The clock, Watson." "The time," Holmes hissed, gripping my arm with fingers like iron calipers. I consulted my pocket watch by the flicker of a passing wall sconce. "It is 7 minutes to midnight, Holmes. But if Graves is the accomplice and the ghost is in the rafters, why did we leave them? We could have apprehended them both then and there. And what of the motive, man? What of the missing links?" Holmes' eyes were narrowed, his gaze darting across the dark wainscoting as if he could see through the very wood. "To arrest a valet for rigging a spirit lamp is a trifle. I want the hand that moves the bow. I want the why behind this elaborate charade. A man does not build a laboratory in a chimney flue merely to frighten a young heiress. There is a deeper, more predatory game afoot." We reached the music room wing just as the first low rumble of thunder shook the manor's foundations. The sound seemed to groan through the very stones of the house. Suddenly, a sharp, piercing cry echoed from the direction of the mistress chambersnot, a ghostly melody, but a scream of genuine mortal terror. "Miss Vance!" I cried, instinctively reaching for my revolver. We raced down the gallery, our footsteps thundering on the oak planks. As we rounded the corner toward Ilara Vance's suite, we nearly collided with Graves. The valet was dishevelled, his stiff collar torn, and a thin trickle of blood blooming like a dark carnation on his temple. He looked at us with glazed, unseeing eyes before collapsing against the wall. "The window," he gasped, pointing toward the end of the hall. He came through the window. The shadow. Holmes did not stop to tend to the wounded man. He threw open the door to Miss Vance's sitting room. The chamber was in a state of violent upheaval. A heavy mahogany table had been overturned, and the velvet curtains had been torn from their rings. Of Ilara Vance there was no sign. The French doors leading to the stone balcony stood wide open, shivering in the rising wind. "Stay with Graves, Watson. See to his wound," Holmes commanded. He leaped toward the balcony, his silhouette framed for a second by a jagged flash of lightning. I knelt beside the valet, who was moaning softly. The wound on his head was shallow, but sang of a heavy blow, likely the butt of a pistol or a weighted cane. As I applied my handkerchief to the injury, I noticed something peculiar. Graves' hands were stained with a dark, oily residue, and the scent of bitter almond cyanide wafted faintly from his clothes. "What happened, Graves? Who was it?" I demanded. "The master," he whimpered, his voice a mere thread. He came back. I told him I wouldn't help any more. I told him the detective knew, and then the dark took me. A sudden, violent crash echoed from the music room at the far end of the wing. It was the sound of shattering glass-heavy, expensive glass. Leaving Graves, I dashed toward the music room. I found Holmes standing in the center of the room, amidst a sea of crystalline shards. The display cabinet had been smashed to pieces. The crimson velvet bed, which had held the Vance Stradivarius for 2 months, was empty. Holmes was not looking at the cabinet. He was standing by the grand piano, staring at a single blood-stained sheet of music that had been pinned to the keyboard with a jagged splinter of glass. It was the score for the chaconne, but across the staves a message had been scrawled in a frantic, sprawling hand: "The debt is paid in blood. The golden echo returns to the silence." "He has her, Holmes," I said, my voice trembling. "And he has the violin. We are too late." Holmes turned to me, and for the first time in our long association, I saw a flicker of something resembling genuine alarm in his pale eyes. But it was quickly replaced by a terrifying, cold lucidity. He began to pace the room, his movements erratic, almost rhythmic, as if he were stepping to a beat only he could hear. "Latte. No, Watson. We are exactly on time. But the crime is not what you think. Look at the glass. Look at the trajectory of the shards." He pointed to the floor. The cabinet was broken from the inside. "Inside. That's impossible. In this house, the impossible is merely the truth in a mask," Holmes snapped. He snatched up his magnifying glass, crawling across the floor with the intensity of a bloodhound. Graves was not attacked by a shadow. He was attacked by his own conscientia, perhaps a partner who grew weary of his hesitation. "And Miss Vance—" He stopped, picking up a small, tufted scrap of blue silk from the edge of the broken cabinet. It was a piece of the dress Ilara Vance had been wearing. "She didn't scream because she was being taken, Watson," Holmes whispered, his voice vibrating with a sudden, dark realization. "She screamed because she found what was hidden inside the violin's case. The second crime is not the kidnapping, Watson. The second crime is the murder that happened 2 months ago, a murder that this ghost has been trying to avenge." He stood up, his face a mask of grim determination. "The storm is our ally now. It will drive them to the only place where the finale can be played. To the vault, Watson. To the Vance family crypt. Bring your lamp and your courage, for we are about to meet the dead face to face." Chapter 7. Holmes' strategic play The Storm had reached a crescendo of Wagnerian proportions. Rain lashed against our faces with the sting of small shot as we struggled through the overgrown paths of the Blackwood estate toward the family cemetery. The wind howled through the skeletal branches of the ancient oaks, sounding for all the world like the very violin that had haunted our sleep. Holmes moved with a startling agility, his lantern shuttered to a mere sliver of light, while I stumbled behind, my boots sinking deep into the sodden earth. "The vault, Watson!" "We must reach it before the final movement begins," Holmes shouted over the gale. "But the cabinet, Holmes," I cried, shielding my eyes from a sudden, blinding flash of lightning. "You said it was broken from the inside. How can glass be shattered from within a locked display? Pressure, Watson. Pure physical pressure." He did not slow his pace. Recall the carbonic acid snowed dry ice. If a quantity of it were sealed within a restricted space, such as the hollow body of a violin or a hidden compartment in the base of the cabinet, its transition back into gas would create an immense, invisible force. When the pressure reached its limit, the glass would not merely break, it would explode outward. It was a timed release, designed to coincide with the arrival of the ghost and provide a diversion for a far more tactile theft. We reached the Vance Cemetery, a lonely plot of ground enclosed by a rusted iron fence. In the center stood the family vaulter grim, neo-Gothic structure of grey granite, its door adorned with the stone carvings of weeping angels. As we approached, I saw with a jolt of alarm that the heavy iron door was slightly ajar, the black maw of the tomb beckoning us inward. "He is here," Holmes whispered, his voice suddenly calm, though his eyes burned with a cold fire. "Watson, I must ask you to perform a task that requires both your steady hand and your absolute silence. You must enter the vault alone." I felt a cold prickle of dread. "Alone, Holmes. And you. I shall be your shadow. Our friend is a creature of the dark, and he expects to find only the terrified Miss Vance and the cowering graves. If he sees me, he will bolt like a rabbit. But you, my dear Watson, represent the stolid, predictable hand of the law. You will be the bait that springs the trap." He reached into the folds of his wet coat and produced a small silver object, the very resin he had found in the frost. He pressed it into my hand. "When you find him, and you will not fire unless your life depends on it. Simply show him this. It is the one thing his father never used. Sir Julian never resined his own boughs' graves, did it for him. This resin contains a trace of the same blue dye I found on the attic pipes. It is the mark of the counterfeit." Before I could protest, Holmes stepped back into the swirling mist, vanishing as if he had never been there. I stood before the vault, the wind tearing at my coat, feeling every bit the sacrificial lamb. With a deep breath, I pushed the heavy iron door. It swung open with a screech of rusted hinges that sounded like a dying man's last breath. The interior of the vault was surprisingly dry, but the air was thick with the cloying, sweet scent of lilies and the sharp, metallic tang of ancient dust. My lantern light flickered across the tiers of stone sarcophagi. At the far end, beneath a stained glass window that rattled in the wind, stood the newest monument, the tomb of Sir Julian Vance. Sitting atop the marble slab was the Vance Stradivarius, and standing beside it, her face illuminated by the flickering glow of a spirit lamp, was Elara Vance. She was not the trembling victim we had seen in Baker Street. Her eyes were hard, her lips pulled back in a grimace of triumph. In her hand, she held a heavy, silver-topped Kenneth, very weapon that had likely struck down graves. "So, the doctor comes to witness the finale," she said, her voice echoing strangely in the stone chamber. "Where is your master, Dr. Watson? Has Mr. Holmes finally realized that some ghosts cannot be laid to rest with logic?" "The logic is quite sound, Miss Vance," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I held up the piece of resin. "As is the evidence of your collaboration with Graves, or should I say, your manipulation of him." She fed a cold, brittle sound. "Graves was a fool. He loved my father's memory more than his own life. He believed we were honoring Sir Julian by making the world believe his music lived on. He didn't realize that I needed the golden echo for a very different purpose. To hide the sound of the mason's hammer." The voice came from the shadows behind me. Holmes stepped into the light, his coat dripping, but his expression one of supreme satisfaction. "You didn't want the violin, Miss Vance. You wanted what Sir Julian had hidden inside the vault's walls, the liquid assets he converted into diamonds before his death, to keep them out of your reach. You used the ghost to clear the wing, to terrify the servants, and to give yourself the cover of night to dismantle the masonry of your father's tomb. The music was merely a shroud for the sound of your greed. A pretty theory, Mr. Holmes, she hissed, raising the cane. But a dead detective tells no tales. Perhaps, Holmes remarked, stepping forward. But a dead father might. Look behind you, Miss Vance. I believe the golden echo has one final note to play. Suddenly, from the very depths of the vault, the first notes of the chaconne began to rise not from a mechanical device, but from the darkness itself. And this time, the phrasing was not identical to the Albert Hall recital. It was slow, mournful, and filled with a terrifying, vengeful fury. Chapter 8. The reveal. I shall never forget the expression that crossed Elara Vance's face as those mournful notes rose from the lightless corner of the crypt. It was the look of a woman who had played with the fires of the supernatural only to find herself truly consumed by them. She shrank back against her father's tomb, the silver-topped cane falling from her nerveless fingers and clattering onto the stone floor. "Stop it!" she shrieked. "Graves, if this is your doing, he'll kill you." "Mr. Graves is currently incapacitated, Miss Vance," Holmes said, his voice ringing with a cold, judicial authority. "And he lacks the artistic soul required for this particular rendition. No, the man playing for us tonight is the man whose life you and your father thought you had bought and buried years ago." Holmes stepped toward the shadows and held up his lantern. The beam cut through the dark, revealing a figure that seemed woven from the very dust of the tomb. He was a man of immense age, his hair a wild halo of white, his clothes little more than rags. But his hands long, slender, and powerful held the Vance Stradivarius with a grip of iron. "Luigi Moretti," I breathed. "In the flesh, Watson," Holmes remarked. "Or what remains of it." He was never in an asylum. Sir Julian kept him in a gilded cage in the cellar of the London house for years, using his genius to transcribe and refine the Vance compositions. When Sir Julian died, Moretti escaped, making his way here to reclaim his instrument and his honor. The old man stopped playing, the final note vibrating in the damp air like a sob. He looked at Elara with eyes that burned with a terrible, lucid hatred. "She killed him," the old man rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering over stone. "She killed the master because he grew a conscience. He was going to give the violin back to me. He was going to confess. She couldn't have that. She needed the diamonds." "Ali," Elara hissed, though she backed further into the shadows. "Is it?" Holmes stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the base of the tomb. "Let us look at the facts with the clinical detachment they deserve. You, Miss Vance, found yourself in a precarious position upon your father's death. You knew he had hidden a fortune in diamonds, but you didn't know where. You suspected they were interred with him, but how to search a family vault without arousing the suspicion of the servants or the law?" He began to tick the points off on his long fingers. The anatomy of a haunting clue, the illusion, the reality, the music, Sir Julian's ghost, playing at 12:12. A phonograph rigged in the attic by Graves to provide a curtain of sound. The cold, a spectral presence. Rapid release of carbonic acid gas, dry ice via copper pipes to create mist and fear. The moving rug poltergeist activity. A simple mechanical pulley operated from the hidden chamber above. The broken cabinet, a ghostly escape. A pressure bomb of dry ice sealed in the violin case, timed to explode. Chapter 9. The aftermath, the grey light of a soggy morning, did little to lift the heavy atmosphere that hung over Blackwood Manor, but it brought with it the welcome arrival of Inspector Hopkins and a carriage load of the Kentish constabulary. The storm had spent its fury, leaving the grounds littered with broken branches and the sodden remains of the previous night's illusions. Inside the vault, the scene was one of grim finality. Elara Vance sat huddled on a stone bench, her silk weeds stained with the dust of her father's tomb. The fire had gone out of her. She watched with dull, hollow eyes as the police gathered the scattered diamonds, those frozen tears of her father's greed, and placed them into a leather evidence pouch. "A singular business, Mr. Holmes," Inspector Hopkins remarked, tipping his helmet as he surveyed the dismantled masonry of Sir Julian's resting place. "To think a lady of her standing would spend her nights playing at being a mason and a ghost. It's enough to make a man lose faith in the gentry." "Greed, Hopkins, is a great leveller," Holmes replied, his long fingers stained with the grime of the investigation. It resides as comfortably in a Kentish manor as it does in a Whitechapel cellar. Miss Vance was faced with the prospect of a diminished inheritance and a father who intended to repent for a lifetime of theft. She chose to accelerate the process of her own enrichment. In the hallway of the manor, we found Mr. Graves. The valet had regained consciousness but was a broken man. He sat in the kitchen, a blanket wrapped around his narrow shoulders, weeping silently into a cup of tea. He confessed everything to Hopkins with a weary, mechanical precision. He had loved Sir Julian, but he had feared the daughter more. He had rigged the phonograph and the cooling pipes under her direction, believing her lie that it was merely a way to keep the house quiet and the memory of the master alive. He had not known of the diamonds, nor of the murder. The murder? Hopkins asked, sharpening his pencil. Sir Julian did not die of heart failure, Hopkins, Holmes said, standing by the window and watching the mist rise from the valley. He was being slowly poisoned with small, untraceable doses of digitalis. When he informed his daughter of his intention to return the Stradivarius to its rightful owner and donate his wealth to the poor, she simply increased the dosage. The golden echo was intended to be his requiem, but she turned it into his shroud. The most touching sight, however, was that of Luigi Moretti. The old virtuoso sat in the music room, the Vance Stradivarius rightfully hiss-resting across his knees. He looked 10 years younger in the morning light, though his frame remained frail. "What will become of him, Holmes?" I whispered as we watched the old man gently wipe a speck of dust from the violin scroll. "He is a victim of a great injustice, Watson. I have already spoken to Hopkins. There will be no charges against him for his haunting. In fact, I have arranged for him to stay at a quiet musical sanitarium in Surrey, where his health can be restored. The violin shall remain with him. It is the only thing that truly matters to him." Moretti looked up as we approached. He did not speak, but he took Holmes' hand in his own calloused fingers and pressed it briefly. It was a gesture of gratitude more profound than any words could have expressed. "And the diamonds?" I asked, as we made our way back to the carriage. "They will likely be tied up in Chancery for a decade," Holmes sighed, lighting his first pipe of the day. "A fitting end for stones that have caused so much misery. But the music, what's on the music, has been liberated. That is the true success of this case." As our trap pulled away from the gates of Blackwood Manor, I looked back one last time. The house seemed smaller somehow, less imposing without the weight of its secrets. The ivy no longer looked like grasping fingers, but merely a neglected plant. "It was the cold that baffled me most, Holmes," I admitted as we rattled toward the station. "That unnatural, biting chill. A classic diversion, Watson. We expect ghosts to be cold, therefore, if we feel cold, we assume there is a ghost. By using the carbon dioxide, Miss Vance didn't just create a visual mischief, she created a psychological state. She attacked the senses to bypass the intellect. It was quite brilliant in its own perverse way." Holmes leaned back against the cushions, his eyes closing as the rhythm of the horse's hooves lulled him toward sleep. The tension of the last 48 hours had evaporated, leaving him in that state of languid exhaustion that always followed a successful hunt. "But come, Watson," he murmured, his voice trailing off. "The Kentish air is far too clean for my tastes. I find myself longing for the sulphurous yellow fogs of Baker Street and the delightful unpredictability of the Morning Post. I wonder if Mrs. Hudson has remembered to order those fresh crumpets I requested." I smiled, settling into my corner. The mystery of the violin played after midnight was solved, and though the shadows of Blackwood Manor would linger in my mind for some time, the steady presence of my friend brought a sense of peace. The golden echo had finally found its silence. Chapter 10. The resonance of logic. 3 days had passed since we left the melancholic damp of Kent for the familiar, soot-stained embrace of London. The yellow fog had returned in earnest, swirling against the window panes of 221B Baker Street like the ghosts we had so recently debunked. Within our sitting room, however, all was warmth and order. The fire roared in the grate, casting a golden hue over the chaotic piles of Holmes' reference books and the chemical stains upon the rug. Holmes sat in his customary armchair, his long, thin legs stretched toward the hearth. He was currently occupied with a thick, leather-bound volume, his commonplace book into, which he was meticulously pasting a newspaper clipping from the Morning Post, detailing the arrest of Ilara Vance and the recovery of the Vance diamonds. "It is a curious thing, Watson," he remarked, without looking up from his task. "How the human mind, when twisted by a single-minded passion like greed, can construct a masterpiece of deception only to have it crumble because of a single, forgotten detail." "You mean the resin?" I asked, looking up from my own writing. I was currently engaged in drafting the very narrative that now nears its conclusion. The resin, the blue dye, the temperature of a spirit lamprey are all fragments of a larger truth. But the real flaw in Miss Vance's plan was her choice of music. She chose the chaconne because it was her father's favorite, thinking it would lend authenticity to her ghost. She did not realize that by invoking the music, she was invoking the one man who loved it more than life itself. She brought Luigi Moretti to her doorstep, as surely as if she had sent him a formal invitation. "It was a tragic case, Holmes," I said, leaning back. "To think of that poor old man, living in the shadows, clinging only to the memory of a violin. Tragedy and triumph are often two sides of the same coin, Watson. Moretti has his instrument back. I received a note this morning from the sanitarium in Surrey. They say he spends his days in the garden, and the sound of his playing has brought a singular peace to the other patients. It seems the golden echo is finally being used for its intended purpose to heal rather than to haunt." Holmes rose and paced the room, his hands clasped behind his back. He stopped at the window, peering out into the gloom where the lamps of a passing hansom cab flickered like distant stars. "You know, Watson," he said softly, his voice taking on that philosophical tone that usually signaled the end of a great mental exertion, "the world is full of obvious things which nobody by any chance ever observes. We look at a Gothic manor and see a haunting, we hear a violin and think of a spirit. We allow our emotions to color our perceptions until the truth is buried under a shroud of superstition. But logic pure, cold, beautiful logicis, the light that pierces that fog. It reminds us that behind every miracle and every spectre lies a human motive and a physical cause. And yet, I ventured, there was a certain beauty in the mystery, was there not? The idea of a daughter being haunted by her father's music. Beauty is fine for the poet, Watson, but for the man of science it is a distraction. Give me a clear trail of footprints and a measurable drop in temperature over a dozen poetic hauntings any day." He turned away from the window, a sudden mischievous glint in his eye. He reached for his own violin, which lay atop the piano. "However, I will concede that the chaconne is a magnificent piece of architecture in its own right. If you can endure a few more minutes of my agonizing scrapings, as you called them earlier, I might attempt a few bars myself, though I promise to keep the room at a comfortable temperature." I laughed, setting my pen aside. "I think I can bear it, Holmes." As the first notes of his violin filled our room's blade with a technical precision that, while perhaps lacking Moretti's raw soul, possessed a sharp, intellectual clarity, I found myself reflecting on the man across from me. He was a creature of ice and logic, a human calculator who viewed the world as a series of problems to be solved. Yet, as he played, his features softened in the firelight, and I caught a glimpse of the hidden warmth that he so often tried to conceal. The case of the Vance Stradivarius was closed. The diamonds were in a vault, the culprit was in a cell, and the music had returned to its rightful owner. As the fog pressed closer against the glass, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Life in Baker Street would continue its rhythmic dance of boredom and brilliance, and I knew that before long, another frantic knock would echo at our door, and another unsolvable puzzle would emerge from the London mist. But for tonight, there was only the music, the fire, and the steady, comforting presence of the most remarkable man I have ever known. "Elementary, my dear Watson," Holmes murmured between the notes, a phantom of a smile playing on his lips. "Perfectly elementary." Chapter 11, The Toxicology of Greed. The following morning, the post brought a heavy, official-looking envelope bearing the crest of the Home Office. Holmes, who had been engrossed in a study of the refractive indices of various gemstones, tore it open with an uncharacteristic flourish. He scanned the contents, his eyes darting back and forth with predatory speed, before tossing the papers onto the breakfast table between the marmalade and the toast. "The final nail, Watson," he declared, reaching for his pipe. "The toxicological report from the exhumation of Sir Julian Vance. It confirms my hypothesis with a most gratifying, if grim, precision." I picked up the document, my medical curiosity instantly piqued. "Digitalis, as you suspected?" "Digitalis purpurea in concentrations that would make a heart specialist weep," Holmes replied, a cloud of blue smoke billowing around his head. "But observe the timeline, Watson. The poisoning was not a sudden act of passion. It was a rhythmic, calculated administration, perfectly synchronized with the haunting sessions. Miss Vance was not merely trying to kill her father, she was trying to create a narrative where his weak heart would eventually fail under the stress of the ghostly music." I looked over the findings. The report detailed the presence of the toxin in the hair follicles, indicating a slow, chronic ingestion over several weeks. "She was a monster of patience," I murmured, a chill that had nothing to do with dry ice settling in my bones. "She was a mathematician of murder," Holmes corrected. "She calculated that if the servants heard the music and saw Sir Julian's health failing simultaneously, they would testify to a natural death brought on by supernatural terror. It was a double layer of protection. If the doctors looked for a cause, they would find a weak heart. If the neighbors looked for a cause, they would find a ghost. She forgot only one variable, the human ear. The ear." "Luigi Moretti's ear," Holmes said, standing and beginning to pace the narrow confines of our sitting room. He didn't just hear the music from the attic, he heard the discord. He realized that the phonograph recordings Graves was playing were slightly faster than Sir Julian's actual tempo. It was that minute discrepancy that drove him from his hiding place and into our path. Precision, Watson. It is the rock upon which all great crimes founder. As the morning progressed, we received a visit from a most unexpected guest. It was the young stable hand from the Blackwood estate, a lad named Pippin who had driven our trap on that first misty evening. He looked remarkably more cheerful now that the shadows had been lifted from the manor. He carried a small wooden crate, which he set down upon our rug with a bow. "From Mr. Moretti, sir," the lad said, his cap in his hand. "He's settled in quite nice at that home in Surrey. He asked me to bring you this, with his compliments." Holmes opened the crate. Inside, resting on a bed of straw, was a bottle of vintage Italian wine and a small hand-carved wooden figurine of a violin. Attached to the figurine was a note in a shaky, elegant hand, "To the man who hears the silence. The music continues because the truth was found. Forever in your debt." L.M. Holmes looked at the little wooden carving for a long moment, his features uncharacteristically soft. "A trifle," he muttered, though he placed the figurine prominently upon the mantelpiece, right next to the Persian slipper. "But a well-crafted one." "It seems the case has reached its true conclusion," I said, returning to my notes. "The legalities are in the hands of the Crown, the victim is at peace, and even the local help is breathing easier." "Indeed," Holmes replied, his gaze already drifting toward a stack of unopened letters on the sideboard. "But do not grow too comfortable in your satisfaction, Watson. The criminal element of London is like the Hydra one head is lopped off in Kent, and two more sprout in Stepney. For instance," he plucked a crumpled telegram from the pile. "What do you make of this? Countess Emerald's missing. Bedchamber locked from inside. No footprints. Only a single peacock feather left on the pillow. It seems the world is not quite done with its impossible theatrics." I looked at my friend, whose eyes were already alight with the fire of a new chase. The weariness of the Blackwood case had vanished, replaced by the electric, restless energy that defined his existence. "A peacock feather, Holmes?" I asked, reaching for my hat. "A peacock feather, Watson, a symbol of vanity, or perhaps a signature of a very colourful thief. The 11:15 from Charing Cross should get us to the Countess estate by mid-afternoon. I believe your medical bag might be needed if, not for a patient, then at least for the specialized tools it contains." As we descended the stairs of 221B, the sound of the London streets rose to meet Yuseth roar of the traffic, the cries of the hawkers, and the infinite, pulsing mystery of the great city. The case of the violin played after midnight was a memory, a chapter in a journal, but the game, as always, was afoot. Chapter 12. The final reflection. The train journey to the Countess estate provided a rare moment of repose, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels acting as a metronome to my thoughts. Holmes, however, was not one for idle reflection. He had transformed our carriage into a temporary laboratory, his lap covered in a map of the estate and several magnifying lenses. "You are unusually quiet, Watson," he observed, without lifting his gaze from a topographical survey of the Sussex Downs. "Is the shadow of Blackwood Manor still clinging to your coat?" "In a way, yes," I admitted, closing my notebook. I was thinking of the sheer complexity of Miss Vance's deception. The cooling pipes, the phonograph, the mechanical pullicet was an extraordinary amount of effort to expend on a lie. If she had applied that same ingenuity to a legitimate pursuit, she might have been one of the great minds of our age. Holmes finally looked up, his grey eyes piercing. "A common fallacy, Watson. Ingenuity is not a moral virtue, it is a tool. In the hands of a criminal, it is a scalpel used to cut away the fabric of society." Miss Vance's tragedy was not a lack of intellect, but a lack of imagination. She could only imagine a world where she was wealthy, and her father was silent. She could not imagine the resonance of a conscience, nor the persistence of a man like Moretti. He tapped the map with a long, thin finger. "It is the same with this peacock feather. To the Countess, it is a terrifying omen. To the police, it is a baffling eccentricity. But to us, it is a data point. It tells us something about the thief's vanity, their access to exotic goods, and perhaps their desire to be seen even while they hide." As the train pulled into the station, the sun finally broke through the clouds, bathing the countryside in a brilliant, fleeting gold. It reminded me of the golden Eckhoth name Sir Julian had given to his final performance. "Do you think Moretti will ever play in public again?" I asked as we stepped onto the platform. "I think Moretti has found a different kind of audience, Watson. One that listens not with their ears, but with their souls. There is a profound difference between a performance and a prayer. Sir Julian performed Moretti praise through his wood and catgut. We were met at the station by a sleek, black brougham. As we climbed inside, Holmes leaned back, the familiar light of the hunt returning to his features. "You know, Watson, our adventures are often like a complex symphony. We have the opening hooked discordant note that signals a crime. We have the development, where the themes of greed and deception are explored. We have the climax in the vault or the attic. And finally, we have the resolution, where the logic returns the world to its proper key." "And the aftermath?" I asked. "The aftermath is the silence that follows the music," Holmes said softly. "The moment where the truth is known, and the world holds its breath before the next movement begins." He looked out the window at the passing hedgerows, his profile sharp against the afternoon light. "I have often been accused of being a cold machine, a brain without a heart. And perhaps, in the heat of the chase, that is true. But even a machine must have a purpose. My purpose is to maintain the harmony of the law in a world that is constantly trying to slip into dissonance. If that requires me to be a spectre in a music room or a shadow in a crypt, then so be it." As we approached the Countess gates, I realized that this was the true essence of Sherlock Holmes. He was not merely a detective, he was a restorer of order. He took the chaotic, frightening elements of human natureth murders, the thefts, the impossible hauntings, and reduced them to a series of logical steps. In doing so, he made the world feel safe again, even if only for a little while. "Well, Watson," he said, checking his watch as the carriage came to a halt. "The Countess awaits, and her peacock feather beckons. I believe we have just enough time to solve this before dinner. I am told the Sussex trout is exceptional this time of year." I followed him out of the carriage, my spirits lifted. The mystery of Blackwood Manor was a closed book, its haunting melodies replaced by the sharp, clear air of a new day. The game was once again afoot, and as long as Sherlock Holmes walked the fogs of England, I knew that no secret, however dark or ghostly, would ever remain hidden for long. "After you, Holmes," I said, stepping onto the gravel path. He gave a short, sharp nod, his eyes already scanning the windows of the great house for the first clue. "The logic of the feather, Watson. Let us see where it leads.